249 BC. Morning off the coast of Sicily. The air is thick with the scent of salt, tar, and tension. Hundreds of Roman warships, quinquiremes, stand poised for battle. On the flagship, surrounded by centurions and legates, stands the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher. He gazes at the harbor of the city of Drepana, where the Carthaginian fleet is bottled up, as if in a trap. This is his chance. A chance to shatter Carthage's naval might with a single blow and bring victory closer in the grueling First Punic War. Pulcher was a scion of one of Rome's oldest and most arrogant clans, the Claudii. They were famed for their pride, their contempt for the plebeians, and their unshakable conviction that they were always right. Pulcher was no exception. He was ambitious, impatient, and believed that old traditions were a crutch for the weak. But even for him, there was one ritual that could not be ignored. Before any battle, the Romans were obliged to learn the will of the gods. And they did this in what seems to us a most peculiar way, with the help of sacred chickens. A cage was brought onto the deck. Inside sat special, well-tended birds. Next to the cage stood a priest augur known as a Puliaris, the keeper of the chickens. His task was simple: to throw a handful of sacred grain before the birds. If the chickens greedily lunged at the food so that the grain bounced from their beaks, auspicium tripudium solistimum, it was the greatest sign of divine approval. The battle could begin. But if they pecked sluggishly or refused to eat at all, the gods were against it. The Puliaris opened the cage and scattered the grain. The ship's deck fell silent in anticipation. Hundreds of eyes, from the common rower to the consul himself, were fixed upon the birds. But the chickens didn't move. They milled about in their cage, glancing with indifference at the feast scattered before them. Perhaps they were seasick. Perhaps they simply weren't hungry. But for the superstitious sailors and soldiers, it meant only one thing: catastrophe. The gods had turned their backs on them. A murmur rippled through the ranks. The centurions frowned. Even the most battle-hardened veterans felt an icy pang of fear. To go into battle against the will of the gods was suicide. Pulcher watched this scene with unconcealed irritation. His perfect plan, his surprise attack, his future triumph, all of it was crumbling because of the appetite of some stupid birds. He saw the fear in his men's eyes and knew that any delay would kill their fighting spirit. His Claudian pride boiled over. He would not let superstition stand in his way. He strode forward toward the cage. In the ensuing silence, his voice rang out like a clap of thunder. He looked at the indifferent chickens, then at his terrified soldiers, and with a sarcastic smirk, he uttered a phrase that would go down in the annals of history. Bibant, quaniam esse nolunt. If they won't eat, let them drink. With those words, he ordered the cage with the sacred chickens to be seized and thrown overboard. The birds, symbols of divine will, plummeted with pathetic squawks into the salty waters of the Mediterranean Sea and drowned. A dead, soul-chilling horror descended upon the deck. This was not just a breach of tradition. It was a direct, public, and unthinkable insult to the gods. The consul of Rome had just committed sacrilege in front of the entire fleet. He had thrown down a challenge to Jupiter, Mars, and the entire divine hierarchy. Pulcher, pleased with the effect he had created, gave the order, "Forward to Drepana." The fleet, deprived of divine blessing and led into battle by a man who had spat in the face of the heavens, moved toward its doom. To understand the full gravity of Pulcher's act, one must forget our modern, rational world. For a Roman of the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, the gods were not an abstract concept. They were active participants in daily life. They sent bountiful harvests and droughts, granted health and sickness, and most importantly, decided the outcome of wars. The Roman state was built on the concept of pax deorum, the peace of the gods. It was believed that Rome prospered only as long as the gods were pleased with it. Any important affair of state, from the election of magistrates to the declaration of war, required divine approval. The process of obtaining this approval was called the auspices, divination, most often by observing the flight of birds. But on military campaigns, observing wild birds was inconvenient, so the Romans developed a more mobile system, those very sacred chickens, puli sacri. They were kept in a special cage, cavea, and transported with the army everywhere. Before a battle, the feeding ritual was performed. But on military campaigns, observing wild birds was inconvenient, so the Romans developed a more mobile system, those very sacred chickens, puli sacri. They were kept in a special cage, cavea, and transported with the army everywhere. Before a battle, the feeding ritual was performed. This was not mere superstition. It was the foundation of military discipline and psychology. Psychological confidence. Soldiers who saw the chickens pecking greedily went into battle with an unshakable belief in victory. They knew that Mars, the god of war, was on their side. This was an incredible morale boost that doubled their strength. A tool of command. A clever general could manipulate the auspices. If he needed to delay a battle, for instance, to await reinforcements or secure a more advantageous position, and the chickens were hungry, he could simply declare the omen unfavorable. The Polarius, the keeper of the chickens, was often in collusion with the commander. There are stories of chickens being deliberately starved before a crucial battle to guarantee a hearty appetite, and, consequently, the approval of the gods. Unity and order. The ritual united the army. Everyone, from the consul to the last legionary, submitted to a single, higher will. This prevented disputes and doubts about orders. Pulcher's act destroyed all three of these pillars. He didn't just kill the birds, he destroyed his soldiers' confidence, broke the established order, and declared that his personal will was superior to the will of the gods and the state. To a Roman soldier, this meant their commander was a madman leading them to certain death. The Battle of Drepana, the price of pride. The Carthaginian fleet at Drepana was commanded by the admiral at Hairball. Unlike Pulcher, he was not a politician, but an experienced naval commander. His scouts immediately reported the approach of the Roman fleet. At Hairball realized that Pulcher was trying to trap him in the narrow harbor, but instead of waiting, he made a bold and brilliant decision to break out into the open sea. As Pulcher's lead ships entered the harbor, they saw to their horror that the Carthaginian fleet was already sailing out to meet them, rounding an island to the south. The Roman plan for a surprise attack had failed. Panic ensued. Pulcher, realizing his mistake, tried to reorganize his fleet. He ordered the ships to turn around, but his fleet of more than 200 vessels was stretched out in a long line at the harbor entrance. The order to reverse course caused complete chaos. Ships began colliding with each other, breaking oars, and losing formation. The discipline, already undermined on shore by the consul's sacrilege, collapsed completely. Meanwhile, at Hairball's fleet, having reached the open sea, formed a perfect battle line. The Carthaginians were more experienced sailers, their ships faster and more maneuverable. They had room to maneuver, while the Romans were pinned against the coast, unable to retreat or reform. The slaughter began. The Carthaginian quinqueremes, like predators, descended upon the clumsy, clustered Roman ships. They employed the classic tactics of diaplus, breaking the line, and periplus, outflanking. They rammed the Romans in their sides, smashed their oars, and then pulled away, preventing the Romans from boarding them, where their infantry would have had the advantage. The Roman sailors, demoralized and cursed by the gods, fought without enthusiasm. They watched their formation disintegrate, saw their ships go to the bottom or be captured by the enemy one by one. They were trapped between the shore and the merciless Carthaginian fleet. Publius Claudius Pulcher, seeing that the battle was lost, acted like a true Claudian. He saved himself. On his flagship with about 30 other ships, he managed to break through and disgracefully fled the battlefield, abandoning the rest of his fleet to its fate. The results of the Battle of Drepana became one of the greatest naval disasters in Rome's history. Of the approximately 210 ships, 93 ships were captured by the Carthaginians along with their crews. Even more were sunk. Only the pathetic handful that fled with Pulcher managed to escape. Rome lost around 20,000 men, killed and captured. Carthage did not lose a single ship. It was a complete, absolute, and humiliating defeat. A defeat that began with a few chickens refusing their breakfast. Trial and shame when the gods send the bill. When news of the catastrophe reached Rome, the city was consumed by grief and fury. But the anger was directed not so much at Pulcher's military incompetence as at his sacrilege. Everyone was convinced the fleet was lost not because of tactical errors, but because the gods had punished Rome for the arrogance of his consul. The Pax Deorum had been broken, and now atonement was required. Pulcher was immediately recalled to Rome. He was charged not with military failure, after all, many Roman generals lost battles, but with the gravest of accusations, per duellio, high treason, expressed through his insult to the gods and disregard for the auspices. The trial was a sensation. The tribunes of the people demanded the death penalty for him. Pulcher, using all the influence of his powerful clan, tried to defend himself. He argued that he had acted in the interests of the state, unwilling to miss a military opportunity because of superstition. The trial was tense. His fate seemed sealed. But then, by a twist of fate, nature intervened. During the court session, a violent thunderstorm broke out. According to Roman law, this was considered an unfavorable omen, and the proceedings had to be adjourned. One of the tribunes who supported the Claudii used this to dismiss the assembly. It seemed Pulcher was saved, but the Roman people were not about to forgive him. Soon, a new, lesser charge was brought against him, on which he was still found guilty. He was sentenced to a colossal fine for the time, 120,000 asses. It was a public humiliation. His political career was destroyed. He was disgraced and died in exile soon after the trial, despised by all. But the story did not end there. The Romans believed that the wrath of the gods extended to the entire family of the blasphemer. A few years later, Pulcher's sister, Claudia, got stuck in a crowd on a Roman street. Annoyed by the slow-moving populace, she exclaimed in frustration, "Oh, if only my brother were alive and leading a fleet again to thin out this crowd." These words were taken as a direct insult to the memory of the fallen at Drepana, and yet another display of Claudian arrogance. Claudia was immediately taken to court and also fined an enormous sum. The curse of the sacred chickens haunted their entire family. The legacy of the drowned chickens. The story of Publius Claudius Pulcher became a textbook case for the Romans. It was told to children, cited as an example by historians and orators like Cicero and Livy. It became an eternal lesson on the consequences of pride, superbia, and impiety, impietas. This incident strengthened rather than weakened faith in the auspices. Subsequent generations of Roman generals treated religious rituals with even greater reverence. Even the most pragmatic and cynical among them understood. One might not believe in the chickens, but one could not ignore their soldiers' belief in them. During the Second Punic War, after the crushing defeat at Cannae, the consul Gaius Terentius Varro, one of those responsible for the disaster, was met in Rome not with curses, but with gratitude,
simply because he had not despaired of the Republic. His colleague, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who died in the battle, had received unfavorable omens before the fight, but was forced to submit to Varro's decision. After that event, the authority of the auspices became indisputable.
Even Julius Caesar, known for his rationalism, never publicly neglected the rituals. He understood their value in maintaining morale and discipline. The story of the sacred chickens is not just an amusing historical anecdote. It is a window into the worldview of an entire civilization. It shows how closely religion, politics, and war were intertwined in ancient Rome. It demonstrates that for a great empire that built aqueducts and roads, created a legal system, and conquered half the world, the appetite of a few birds could hold more weight than the strategic genius of a commander. Publius Claudius Pulcher's act was not one of atheism, but of supreme arrogance. He did not deny the existence of the gods. He simply decided that his personal ambitions were more important than their will. And for that, he, his family, and the entire Roman fleet paid a terrible price. On that day off the coast of Drepana, the gods taught Rome a harsh lesson, one that was heard and learned for centuries to come. A lesson that began with a simple question: would the chickens eat their breakfast today?